Purim is an enigmatic holiday. It's difficult to exactly understand the nature of the day, how we're supposed to observe it, how we're supposed to experience the Simcha of Adar and the Simcha of Purim itself. Allow me to share with you two Gemarot that I think offer deep insight into what the rabbis were doing in the creation of this special holiday. Says the Gemara in Megillah, Tanu Rabbanan, we learn in a Braita. Arba'im u'shmona nevi'im v'sheva neviyot. There were 48 prophets and 7 prophetesses. Nitnabu lahem liYisrael. They were prophesying over all of Jewish history, these 55 amazing human beings. And the rabbis teach us something that seems somewhat surprising. V'lo pichatu v'lo hotiru al ma shekatuv b'Torah. They didn't add and they didn't subtract anything from the Torah. Well, of course the prophets didn't do that. That's biblically forbidden. Bal tosif, bal tigra. But the Braita concludes, except for one thing. These 55 prophets, they created one very new idea. Mikra Megillah. The reading of the Megillah, the sort of fundamental ritual act of the holiday of Purim, was created by these amazing prophets, these amazing human beings. And so the Gemara asks, my Darush, how did they know? How did they darshan and figure out that it's appropriate to read the Megillah? The word darush, darash, midrash assumes a verse, a pasuk. If you look at the Midrashei Tanaim, the Midrashei Halacha, or the Midrashei Agadah of the Amoraim, it'll always start with a verse, maybe from Tehillim or Mishlei or Eov, Hadahu Dichtiv, and then we'll quote a verse from Breshit and a verse and make a link, a literary connection. But the Gemara doesn't give us a pasuk. It can't go back to the Chumash because obviously it could only go perhaps to Mikra Megillah, to the Megillah itself. But what is the Gemara's answer? The Gemara's answer itself fascinates me. Amr Rabbi Chia bar Avin, Amr Rabbi Yoshua ben Korcha. What was the midrash? What was the drash that these 55 amazing prophetic human beings came up with to establish Mikra Megillah? If when we came out of Egypt and we were only enslaved, but now we became free, we recited Hallel, Amrin Shira, Mimita L'chaim, Lo Kol Shekain. All the more so, Haman wanted to kill everybody. It was genocide, Minar Va'ad Zakein, from the young to the old. And so the salvation, the redemption of Purim is at some level even more deserving of Shira than Yetziat Mitzrayim itself. And so the rabbis offer an answer. My Darush, what gave the prophets the right to create this new holiday, this new ritual called Mikra Megillah? Not a pasuk, not a midrash in the classic sense, but rather a svara, a simple, rational, logical argument that says the salvation of Pesach was amazing. The salvation of Purim was more amazing. If on Pesach, Omrim Shira, we say Hallel, all the more so on Purim itself, because it was Mimita L'chaim, because Haman wanted to wipe out the entirety of the Jewish people. This moment, this shift from my Darush, what's the midrash? What's the source? And the answer to that question being svara, a logical argument. At some level, that's the whole point. That's what makes Purim, Purim. It's the first rabbinic holiday. It's the first time where we need to figure out how to create a moment to mark this moment of salvation, of redemption, without prophets. For the world of Chazal, they don't have access to Nivuah anymore. There are no Nevi'im or Nevi'ot. They have to figure it out to the best of their human limited capacities. And what the rabbis do is they make arguments from analogy. They make logical, rational, reasonable arguments. And that's how Purim gets started, through a rational argument from Pesach to Purim. And that's ultimately how the rabbinic tradition gets born. The Gemara then says, but wait a minute. If we're going to use that rational argument, then shouldn't we then, in fact, be reciting Hallel? If it's about Omrim Shira, asks the Gemara, Ihachi Hallel Nami Nema. So we should say Hallel, which dafka we don't say Hallel in Purim. The Gemara then offers 3 different answers as to where Hallel went for Purim itself. Because if we just use our Svara, Umame Avdut Lecherut, if on Pesach we say Hallel, on Purim too. So first answer, technical answer, perhaps Lafisha Ein Omrim Hallel Al Hanes Shebechutza La'aretz. The miracle of Purim was diasporic, was not in Eretz Yisrael. Therefore, it doesn't get the benefit of Hallel. The Gemara then analyzes that for a moment, skipping that brief analysis. Second answer of Nachman Amar, Kriyata Zohilula. You know what? It turns out that Kriyat HaMegillah itself serves as the Hallel of Purim. So much so that says the Meiri, if you're stuck in a desert island and all you have is a Sefer Tehillim, you left your Tanakh Shalem at home, but you have your Tehillim, you could read the Tehillim of Hallel and fulfill the obligation of Mikra Megillah. I guess you also don't have access to Zoom. You can't zoom in. Second answer, the Megillah stands in for Hallel. Third answer, and this is a very deep and perhaps amongst the saddest lines of the Talmud Bavli. Why don't we say Hallel on Purim? Rava Amar, Rava in Bavel says, Bishlama Hatam, I understand in the context of Pesach, in the context of Yitziat Mitzrayim, we can say Halalu Avdei Hashem. We can really be servants of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Velo Avdei Paro. You know what? Pharaoh is out of the picture. Elahacha. But in the context of Purim, Halalu Avdei Hashem, how could we say that we're servants of Hashem? Velo Avdei Achashverosh. In the end of the story, Mordechai is only Mishneh LaMelech. We are still ultimately subservient to Achashverosh at the end of Mikra Megillah. And then says Rava, and here it's so sad. Akati says Rava, nevertheless, we today, here in Machoza, in Bavel, 1,000 years after the Megillah, after Mordechai and Esther in Shushan, Avdei Achashverosh Anan. We're still enslaved to Achashverosh, to this very day. Because ultimately, if we are not masters of our own destinies, we can't truly be Avdei Hashem. And we see the whims of capricious human leaders happening right now. The fear, the anxiety of turning on the news, of what's going to happen next in Ukraine. We see what it means to have a vicious leaders in this world. And therefore, in the end of the day, Akati Achashverosh, Avdei Achashverosh Anan. We're all ultimately enslaved to human leaders. This Gemara perhaps takes on a different kind of meaning after Kom HaMedina, after 1948. And there's something fabulous about Purim in Israel, particularly in Yerushalayim. There's something where you can get a sense of a country that's just alive with the joy of the day in a way that you can't really experience, even in Riverdale, Ir HaKodesh. And so ultimately, the deeper message of Purim, the desire of the rabbis, is to learn how to use our human intellect, to use svara, to find God, to read the Megillah, and instead of reading it as Hamelech, to read it as Hamelech, to see behind all the complicated machinations of Mordechai and Esther, and Bigtan and Teresh and Haman and Vashti, to be able to peer behind the psukim, to do, by the way, midrash, to darshan those psukim, so that we can find God, even though God is Anochi Astir. God is hidden. We have to work hard these days to find God in our lives. When Rava says, Akati Avde Achashverosh Anan, you can hear the sadness of what it means to live in Machoza in the 4th and the 5th century. And it's Rava too, who's the hero of another Gemara. When the Gemara tells us that the events of Har Sinai were experienced as HaKadosh Baruch Hu hanging a barrel over our heads, Kaf Aleim Har Kigigit. And then if Har Sinai was coercive, then maybe we don't have to keep the Torah at all. Moda'a Rabbah Le'oraita, it's under duress. Finally, Amar Rava, our friend Rava in Machoza says, you know what? Af al pichein, it's true that Har Sinai was coercive because God was so present. How could they have possibly said no? Af al pichein hadur kibluha b'yamei Achashverosh. Even though we're still enslaved, Akati avde Achashverosh anan, it was dafka in the time of Achashverosh, in the time of Anochi Aster Astir Panan. Then it was Kimu v'Kiblu. Then the Jewish people could make a choice. Human free will is fully expressed in a time of divine absence. The svara of the rabbis, the brilliance of rabbinic Judaism, to take Torah models and put them in place, to go from Pesach and give us Purim, to take a Mikdash Ma'at and give us a Beit Knesset, to become a people of the book that can travel all around the world, allows us to engage in that same ever unfolding process of revelation. My bracha for each of us this Purim is that we engage in Midrash. We engage with the Torah. We live in a Beit Knesset and in a Beit Midrash, in a world that is filled with books and tefillah and chesed. And each of us, though we experience what it means to be in a very painful way, Avdei Achashverosh, we also find the opportunity to lekayem ulekabel, to of our own free will, accept the Torah anew, once again. Purim Sameach.